Good afternoon, everyone. The spotlights today are really bright. I'm Jim White, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I would like to welcome you to today's Abbey Speaker Series event, How to Evaluate Economies. The Abbey Speaker Series is hosted by UNC's Program for Public Discourse, which seeks to build our students' capacities for debate and deliberation and to foster a culture of constructive dialogue about issues of national importance at UNC and beyond. 4 times each year, the Abbey Speaker Series brings together experts from different fields and disciplines to showcase productive dialogue on timely issues across a range of perspectives. On behalf of the university, I would like to thank the Abbey family for helping us bring such important programming to campus. The state of the economy is a constant topic of conversation, not only in political campaigns, but in everyday discussions about the price of eggs at the supermarket, the challenges of running a business, or the job prospects of graduating seniors. We do not, however, always stop to analyze the metrics we are using to evaluate the economy or to consider that disagreements about the state of the economy might stem from different judgments about what metrics should be used. Today's panel brings together experts who have wrestled with the challenges of evaluating economies in their roles as researchers, policy advisors, and public administrators. I want to remind the audience that the views expressed by panelists do not necessarily reflect those of the university or the sponsoring programs. So thank you all for joining us today, and now I turn it over to Kevin Marinelli, Executive Director of the Program for Public Discourse. Kevin.
Good evening. Thank you, Jim. As Executive Director of the Program for Public Discourse, I want to thank the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics program for co-sponsoring this program. And on a personal note, I just want to add that it's always a pleasure to co-sponsor something with the PPE, so that when people inevitably invert our acronyms, we can just say, yep, you're correct. PPE, PPD, it all works. So thank you. As Jim noted, tonight's panel brings together experts who have different perspectives on how to evaluate economies. Kaushik Basu is Professor of Economics and the Karl Marx Professor of International Studies at Cornell University. From 2012 to 2016, he served as Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank. Prior to that, he was Chief Economic Advisor to the Indian government. Kaushik has published widely in development economics, industrial organization, game theory, and welfare economics. Robert Doar has led the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI, another acronym, since 2019. AEI is a think tank known for its commitment to democracy, free enterprise, and American global leadership. Doar initially joined AEI in 2014 to lead the Institute's Opportunity and Mobility Studies program after serving for more than 20 years in leadership positions in the social service programs of New York State and New York City. While at AEI, he has served as a co-chair of the National Commission on Hunger and as a lead member of the AEI Brookings Working Group on Poverty and Opportunity. Unfortunately, Carol Graham from the Brookings Institute is down with the flu. We are disappointed that she couldn't make it and wish her a speedy recovery. The panel is, however, still planning to discuss her research on welfare economics. Our moderator, Doug MacKay, is a professor at UNC's Public Policy Department and also core faculty in philosophy, politics, and economics. His research and teaching interests focus on questions at the intersection of justice and public policy. He is currently working on projects concerning the just design of health and social policy and the ethics of public policy research. We will take questions from the audience at 4 o'clock. During this time, please raise your hand and someone will bring you a mic to ask your question. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please consider signing up for our listserv by clicking the email icon at the top of our website. Joining our listserv ensures you will be notified of upcoming events and also allow you to stay informed about the activities of our affiliates and our undergraduate fellows. And now, I turn the conversation over to Doug.
Thanks everyone for coming today. So Kaushik, I'll give this first question to you. So the central question of today's event is how we evaluate economies. So how do we know if an economy is doing well? And I suspect, like me, a lot of people in the audience are not economists, but we read the news, and it seems that the economy, at least the general idea, is that the economy is doing well when gross domestic product is growing, we have high GDP per capita or high income per capita, the unemployment rate is low, the inflation rate is low. And so my first question has two parts. First, why are these traditional metrics of how an economy is doing important? Why are these the things that we tend to look at? And then secondly, are there any dimensions of our economic life that these metrics might fail to capture, that we have reason to be concerned about?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here, to join both of you. The valuation of an economy, for a long time, there was no such thing that anybody used. We felt good individually, or we did not feel good. We knew our neighbors were feeling good, but it remained that way. Somewhere along the line, actually a lot of it was in the United States, Simon Kuznets comes in with the notion of national income, the total income of the nation. And that was meant to be an evaluation of the aggregate well-being of society. The trouble is, human beings are innately competitive once a measure gets built. Everyone watches that measure, and you begin to chase that one. So for an economist especially, it seems completely natural that GDP or GNP, there are minor definitions and differences, but it's the total income, which is the crucial thing. And I do remember when I was at the World Bank, World Bank ranks countries, and you move up from being a low-income country to lower middle-income country, etc. And occasionally when a country would move up from low to lower middle income, we would get reports of celebration in the streets that people were going after that. Subsequently, people have become aware that the overwhelming importance given to GDP is partly constructed. It's an important concept, extremely important, but you get hooked to that. But there are many dimensions to it. You were touching on some of them. And subsequently, there have been multi-dimensional measures where you look at the standard of living. The Human Development Report that the UNDP brings out says that, look, GDP should be one part, but there are other things. You want to measure health. How do you do it? Just take the expected life expectancy. Literacy is important in itself, whether or not it contributes to GDP. So you take these, you get either pull them into, again, another measure, or leave it at that. So as an initial remark, I have lots of other things to come into. For instance, I hope I'll get a chance to talk about it. The distribution, to me, is important, and people have talked about it. Whereas GDP, I'll just close with that, is treated as this one all-encompassing measure. And among those measures, it is about the best. But should we live with one encompassing measure or think of others? We can get into that.
Robert, do you want to?
So first of all, I want to say how happy I am to be here. I've been on the campus many times in the past 4 or 5 years since I've come to AEI, and I love UNC. I have a healthy discomfort with Blue Devil. So I grew up in Brooklyn, where the goal of every kid was to play for Dean Smith and run the four corners, and that was my goal for a long time. So I'm very happy to be here, and I thank you for inviting me, and it's great to be with Professor. I would just say that quick answer to your question is yes and yes. These numbers are very important that cover our economy. They show the health of the economics of the country, and they show the income levels of people. And I'll talk about why that's so important. But obviously, they can't be all the measures. I've just served or our AEI scholars have been on a project to measure the state of the nation. And on these measures of economics, it's very strong. But on measures of mood or confidence, or there's sort of spiritual measures, they're not so strong. And we should look at both of them. Just for a moment on the measurements of the economy, and this is important background, I am not an academic, I'm a practitioner. I went to work for Governor Pataki and Mayor Bloomberg to work in the social services departments to see that the people that struggled the most in our state and city could move up and prosper economically. I had grown up at a time in New York City that things weren't so well for the poorest. My dad had run an anti-poverty program in Bedford-Stuyvesant that wasn't that successful, and I wanted to do better. And when I went to work for the governor and then the mayor, it was very clear to me that the people that struggled the most in our city and state were the ones that could most benefit when the economy was strong. That when employers are hiring, when they're competing for workers, when they're raising wages, when they're making profits, the wind was at our backs in the social services world. And the number of people that were seeking our aid was fewer and they were more manageable. And those that were seeking our aid were easier to help because being able to work and earn, and then we had a theory of social services, which was we want people to work, but when the wages from work aren't enough to support a family, we want to supplement those wages with supports that make work pay, as President Clinton used to say. That was just a lot easier. And I should just also say that when those things were going well, the wind was at our back, it was easier to help people feel more prosperous, more dignity. They had greater dignity. They were able to support their families, to set an example, and also the life of the neighborhood. You know, if you're running social services in New York City or any major city, you want to be in a community where people are getting up and engaged in their community through the fact that they had to go to work. And when that's not there, when, as William Julius Wilson wrote, when the work goes away, whole communities suffer. Families, individuals, children. So I'm absolutely, I watch these numbers very closely. I think we should talk about what can be manipulated and what measurements are better than others. But the economic numbers of our country are really important. The last point I'll say about our current state, we are in good economic numbers. These both compared to where we've been in the past and compared to where the rest of the world is. And I wouldn't trade places with Europe or China or Russia or anywhere else in the world because of the strength of our American economy. And what we may find as we talk about the policies that are under discussion now, high tariffs, heavy restrictions on immigration, a big sort of new interest in industrial policy, a little bit of crony capitalism. All of that is a prescription for problems. And we may find fairly soon, I'm worried that we will find in 2 or 3 years, that the economy of 2024 was something all of us preferred than what we have at that point. And for people like me who work for the least among us, the poorest Americans, a strong economy is vital to helping them move up.
Great, wonderful. So Sally's agreement that GDP really matters, GDP per capita really matters, both in terms of giving us a measure of how the economy overall is doing, and then GDP and GDP growth are just really important for thinking about how individuals are doing, and particularly, you know, really ensures that people who are worse off in society are doing as well as possible. So we will come back to distribution momentarily. But I wanted Carol Graham unfortunately can't be with us, and I wanted to get some of her views just on the table for us to think about and discuss. And so I think that there's a nice segue here because Kaushik, you said that you know, GDP was sort of meant to be a kind of measure of aggregate well-being in a society. And you also, both of you mentioned things like mood also mattering, health and literacy. And so Carol Graham has really been a proponent for years in favor of using well-being metrics to think about how economies are doing. And like you, she's someone who thinks that we don't want to throw out, you know, the traditional metrics, but we're going to supplement them with well-being metrics. And so just to give you a flavor of the types of things that she's been working on and is in favor of. So she's been involved, a lot of other people have been involved with really using large-scale surveys to collect data on different dimensions of people's well-being. So one of these is often called a hedonic metric, where And this goes back to, or refers back to, hedonism, which is a philosophical review about the nature of the good life. And these are metrics that really try to get a sense of the quality of people's experiences, their affective state, sort of day to day, and try to get a sense of, are people in their daily activities, are they experiencing joy? Are they experiencing pleasure? Or are they experiencing things like anger, stress, sort of negative emotions? And sort of what are the activities where these things go together, right? So you can imagine spending time with friends, spending time in leisure activities tends to bring about joy and positive feelings. Working, commuting, not so much, right? And then there's interesting questions about what about taking care of your children, right? And where's that fit in terms of this? Another type of metric is evaluative metrics, where you're doing sort of life satisfaction surveys, right? Asking people, how satisfied are you with your life? And it's not so much getting at how are people experiencing the world and the quality of those experiences sort of moment to moment, but getting at a more cognitive evaluative judgment about how things are going. And here too, this seems important just in the sense that you can collect this data, then look for really strong correlations between people who say they're very satisfied with life and then other circumstances, right? Whether they're married, have a high income, strong social relationships, employed, and so on. And so Graham argues that these types of metrics often provide a different picture of what is happening to people and can provide insight into policies to sustain human welfare in the future. So a lot of countries are starting to move into the direction of sort of adding these types of metrics to their data collection and using this type of evidence to design public policy. And so I guess the big question is, should the United States follow suit and add such metrics to how it's thinking about how the economy is doing? And I just want to also put on the table that, and this is, there might be interesting conflicts, right, between sort of the traditional metrics and these evaluative metrics and hedonic metrics, just in the sense that if you think about things like unemployment, right, we might want in an economy to have it be very dynamic, right, where we're allowing businesses to fail, we're allowing people to lose their jobs. Hopefully they'll get another job after, but we want a very dynamic economy that's going to be good for economic growth. But we also know that unemployment, and particularly deep unemployment, long-lasting unemployment, is very, very bad for well-being. And so there's sort of the possibility of really difficult value judgments that we might need to make. So that's my best attempt to sort of present some of the work that Carol Graham has been doing. And I don't know if either of you want to take the lead. Robert?
Well, so I know Carol, she's a neighbor of ours in Washington, and I know her work, and as I think I said before, there's nothing wrong with more measures and different measures. I would just introduce a little complexity to the discussion, and I'm curious what the professor says. Survey data, there's a scholar at AEI who's also at the University of Chicago. We look at survey data a lot when we measure poverty, for instance. And we found, it's pretty well established, that people don't always respond to surveys accurately. And that becomes very clear to someone like me, who ran the SNAP program and the Medicaid program, who knows from administrative data what is the income resources coming into households in a big and significant and pretty accurate way, because it's administrative data, dollars flow, they are received, money is spent. While a survey, people don't always tell, they aren't exactly accurate. They can't remember, they underestimate. I don't know if anybody in this room has ever been in a large-scale survey study. I have, run by the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They're exhausting. They take hours. They pay you, but it's brutal. And so I think we ought to be careful about data that is entirely reliant on surveys. Having said that, I want to be clear. Dan Cox runs the Survey Center on American Life at AEI. He's the most quoted AEI scholar. He's one of the most quoted scholars, period. We do a lot of work on relationships, the changing dynamics of marriage and childbearing. It's important stuff. We're learning a lot. But you do have to be conscious that sometimes the survey data doesn't actually get you the real picture of what's happening. And that was very clear to me in New York City when you could get a different perception about the same household who was responding to something saying one thing, and yet the admin data showed something else entirely. And that included earnings and the receipt of various benefits.
And so one interesting thing there is just in terms of, we have these different metrics, and some of them are more objective, right? In the terms of administrative data, you can look at people's income and so on. And some are relying on sort of self-reports and subjective judgments. And so there is sort of a difference there.
Yeah.
Yes, I do want to jump in on this, and something very close to what Robert just said. I did not have the advantage of having Carol as a neighbor, but I do know of some of her work and want to jump in. One important reason why some of these surveys are difficult is also the question that you're asking about your happiness, for instance, or satisfaction. In early economics, there used to be debates about interpersonal comparisons of utility. My statement about myself and your statement could be a language difference, could be a cultural difference. One group could like to describe themselves as miserable, another group may not. So in surveys,
People like that in Brooklyn.
so in surveys, there is that kind of problem, whereas if you're asking how many units of apples do you have, oranges do you have, and I'm going to add it all up, true that you're missing out on something about life satisfaction, you're just doing a mechanical toting up. But these are the pros and cons. The GDP, the way we do it, and I think one reason why the GDP caught on is, yes, there will be minor errors, conceptual problems that keep cropping up, you're making corrections, but nevertheless, it's a very, very well-defined thing. It's true that it's not giving an ultimate statement about satisfaction, whereas if you go over to direct surveys, the trouble is, yes, people are saying how they feel, but the interpersonal comparison becomes so big that comparing, saying that these people are the happiest because they describe themselves as the happiest, may not be quite right. That comes up over here. Just one comment on unemployment that you mentioned, and in the context of Carol's work itself. See, unemployment, you have to be a bit cautious that in a vibrant economy, where you're becoming unemployed and then again getting back into employment, you take one kind of an attitude, and which is that turnovers have to happen, you don't want to block that. But the way the world is going now, with the arrival of digital technology, artificial intelligence, where the space for work is shrinking, we have to really think in terms of very profound ways. We have to get back to the unemployment question, because it will be very different kinds of questions that we will have to confront.
And I would state one other important, very important metrics comment. And it's kind of related to what we've talked about. And that is, when you're looking at income in households, or any measurement of changing resources in households, you have to look at market economy plus taxes plus benefit transfers. And you have to make sure that you're using an inflation adjustment that's accurate. And there's a lot of mixing and merging of that. And if you have a society or a country like the United States that's made up its mind in a bipartisan way to supplement incomes at the bottom with transfers or work supports, and the reason you're doing that is to reduce poverty or to reduce inequality, that means when you measure the outcome of that, you shouldn't forget to count that, because you did it for the purpose of addressing the problem. And so you ought to say, well, we did this, let's see how we did. And then I think when you do that, long-standing position of people like me, is that you see that poverty is actually much lower than you thought it was, and inequality is not as bad as it was. And the idea of not counting that, especially when you think the way to solve it is to add more, is just not accurate. And so I think that's an important thing to understand about the way economic measures are played. Our government is so involved in supplementing the incomes of Americans, to not count that income when evaluating the results is not accurate.
I want to move to distribution in a moment, but do you think that, just pushing back on the well-being metrics, do you think there's things that we're just not going to capture particularly well with income. And so I'm thinking like with life satisfaction surveys, I agree there's going to be errors. People are going to respond to these in different ways. But if we get enough people answering these surveys and we start to see patterns that intuitively just make sense, I also think just with the hedonic measures, thinking about things like mental illness, right? We might be able to really capture well, and also the stress that people might be feeling who are economically disadvantaged in certain ways that might not be captured just.
So any thoughts on that? So I'm trying to sort of advocate for Carol's position here a little bit.
No, I agree
Yeah.
that the GDP has its restriction, and therefore these other things we should get into, but there are two ways of doing that, and even the direct questions are worthwhile. One more thing I should point out, Douglas, if in the same society, you assume that the language of satisfaction is similar over time, if you see ups and downs, you do begin to deduce something, whereas when you across societies see different expression, less meaning to it. So you have to read beneath those meanings. And the other thing that has to be kept in mind is that even if you don't want to be with just GDP or just with these satisfaction measures, there are multidimensional measures, that there are different realistic yardsticks of the quality of life, like education. How much time do you get to go to the opera, listen to music, etc.? If you get these, you don't have to pull it into a GDP, but you get a sense of the quality of life, which is a multidimensional measure.
And I would just say that it's not just measurements of satisfaction that are good to supplement economic numbers. There's all kinds of measures of the area that we do a lot of work on is in education. Reading scores, reading proficiency in third grade, graduation rates. Again, it's administrative data, and it is essential to measure our country in that way. The awful capitulation of or the increase of chronic absenteeism that we haven't recovered from, even after COVID, is horrendous, and we should be looking at that. And one of the sad parts about administrative data and that metric is that it's not reported rapidly enough so that we can see it on a regular basis. I mean, there's so much in government and in sort of academic measurements of American life that we could learn from the private sector, which insists on measurements minute to minute. But when you wake up and you find out that chronic absenteeism, which really in the public schools in the United States isn't great when it's at 8%, chronic absenteeism is you're not in school 10% of the time, and now it's at 20%. Well, we don't really want to wait till next year to find out that it's only come down to 18%. And so I think there needs to be a lot of improvement in the regular reporting of important statistics about education performance. And that's an area where economic data doesn't really give you an answer. Although I would just say one more thing about that. It is fascinating that the monthly jobs report is now just an obsession in America. I mean, we all wait for that first Friday after the close of the month to find out is it going to be 100,000 jobs up, or 500,000 jobs up, or 300,000 jobs down. That's timely, and it does allow us to take a little pulse on our country.
Wonderful. So I'm going to come to jobs next, but let me first go to distribution. And so I think that just from what we've heard already, Robert, you nicely emphasized this. I think when we're thinking about it, what a good economy is, we probably have in mind that people are able to meet their basic needs, to not be in poverty, right? And so that's, I think, a point of agreement. But what should we think about inequality, right? The extent to which economic equality, rough economic equality is important to think about whether an economy is good or not. And so I have in mind, a couple different dimensions. So we might think in terms of income and wealth, right? And whether a society that's incredibly unequal in terms of income and or wealth, is that a good economy? We might also think just in terms of opportunity. So there's been a lot of work in the United States recently, Raj Chetty and others, looking at what social mobility rates look like in the United States in various communities. And at least in a number of cities, a number of areas, if you are a child that's born to parents who are in the top 20%, you have a much better chance of staying there in terms of the income distribution than someone who's born to the bottom 20 or the bottom 40. So Kaushik, I'll put this to you first. And just to what extent, when we're thinking about a good economy, when we're evaluating how economies are doing, to what extent do these different dimensions of economic equality or inequality matter?
Yeah, thank you. I think actually they matter a lot. And to me, inequality as a dimension separate from the aggregate GDP is crucial to look at and to be concerned about. And I'll get to the bottom line. To my mind, the level of inequality today is unacceptable. And I do believe that a time will come when we will be shocked that we tolerated this level of inequality. One more bottom important thing I want to point out, as an economist, I'm aware that inequality plays a role, a useful role. It creates incentives, the ups and downs. It's the extent that I'm talking about, and some of the, what you touched on, sort of the roots of this. You know, it struck me that I took up a strong position from a very sort of everyday incident years ago, visiting home in India. My mother, when she used to be living in Calcutta, visiting her, she lived in a reasonably well-off area, not super well-off, reasonably well-off, but right next to that, there was a super well-off area of Calcutta. Early in the morning, I would go for strolls, visiting her for a week or so, and remember one morning taking a stroll in this super rich area, and something that's striking me that people say that, look, if you work hard enough in life, you can make it. And the thought struck me that there are slums right next door. Some of those kids, no matter how hard they work, they are not going to make it. It's the starting disadvantage which you're referring to, that when you're born into a rich family and when you're born into just no one there to support you, the disparities are too big, and for that there is no justification. You can't say that it is hard work that has made these newborn babies so rich. You couldn't have worked before that, before you arrived on earth. So there's something else going on. So to me, that is extremely important, but you have to do it in a way that you do not want to take away the incentive for enterprise. And so the crucial thing is, I do believe transfers are important. You don't want a big government interfering in everything, but you do want a system of transfer where some of these great inequalities are being flattened out. And there is one more thing which is happening in today's world, which I think is extremely important. You know, we have reports, anthropologists have written from village councils where villagers will be meeting. When a super rich person in the village comes, the poorer villagers keep quiet, they lose their voice. In the world today, in the age of social media and influence, inequality is picking up a dimension where the super rich are developing a voice which is silencing the voice of a lot of people. They don't even see a point in speaking up because they are so small. So it is, to me, this extreme inequality in today's connected digital world is also damaging democracy in a fundamental way. It's still one person, one vote, but not one person, one voice. The voice of a group is getting trampled over. So this is not an easy problem. Lots of countries, lots of governments trying to take on inequality have done so much damage to enterprise that that was not the right thing to do. But for that reason, we must not shirk away and say that let it be the way it is, the inequality. I do believe a time will come when we will be shocked that we tolerate it this much. We need to put our minds together, brains together, to think of ways in which you do it. Enterprise has to be there, people will put in their own money, they will want good returns, you want entrepreneurship, but you don't really need the level of inequality that we have today for that to flourish.
So here we may have some disagreements. In the world that I worked in, there were three measures we cared about. One was poverty properly measured, material well-being of those at the bottom, and we've made great strides in reducing poverty in the United States. The second was mobility, the extent to which people born in the bottom 20% can move up. And there's actually a remarkable amount of that in the United States. And Raj has shown that it particularly happens when there's a lot of work in the community and when there's a lot of two parents actively involved in children's lives. Those are two ingredients that lead to much higher upward mobility for those at the very bottom. And then there's inequality, and I would never say that it's not something we should look at and pay attention to. I look at it all the time. But I do think it can become a distraction that hinders your ability to address the two others. And I think you acknowledge that efforts to do that have upset the dynamism and slower the economy, and I think you have to be very careful about that. And I also think you have to measure it correctly. I think often we look at market income when we look at income inequality, and we don't look at the transfers and tax systems that level things off a little. They take more in taxes from the very wealthy, and they add in transfer payments quite a lot to the very poor. And we've made great strides in closing the gap because of that, and yet when we talk about it, sometimes people leave that adjustment out. I have an economist, the head of economics at AEI, Michael Strain, likes to do a thought experiment with his classes. And he says, now, if I could give you a magic wand, and I told you that you could increase the income of the lowest people at the bottom by 2 times, would you do it? And of course, you'd say yes. But if I told you that you could only do it if you also increased the income for the people at the very top by 2.5 times, so that income inequality got worse, but the people at the bottom got better off, what would you say then? Now, in his exam, I love doing this with another economics professor, because in his classroom, he assumes everybody says, oh yes, I take that deal. Would you take that deal?
I have to give a more nuanced answer that only Robert is asking. So, see, I have actually thought a lot about this. So, yes.
That's why I brought it up.
But
It's risky too, because I could have walked right into the dragon's nest.
yeah. And we may have a disagreement here, so let me spell out. I actually have a paper on this that, poverty is the sort of first matter of concern. So, and you can think of situations in life where inequality goes up when you're trying to diminish poverty, inequality is going up. There, I would say that it is worthwhile living with that inequality. But there are also situations where you have them moving together in ways that the inequality is getting worse, poverty is getting worse. And ceteris paribus, I'm using a term which has vanished from economics, but when I was a student, they used to, other things remaining constant. If inequality can be diminished, I would go for that. So that other thing remaining constant is true. But the example that you gave, I would go along that it's worthwhile. Give the rich more, but if the poor can be given. But if with everything being held constant, inequality can be diminished, it gives greater voice, and I will go for a diminishing of inequality. Not that that always happens. And one more thing I should point out, the example of Russia, USSR, to me striking when it started, or 1917, trying to bring about equality. But it was done with such poorly crafted ways in which you're trying to bring inequality down, that ultimately Russia became a crony capitalist country. So the last stage of communism was crony capitalism, is what you got, a leader with a few cronies around. So the intelligence about doing these things is extremely important.
And I would just address the political question just with another question also that is sort of fascinating about the American situation right now. And I think everyone here, I'm sure, knows that the Republican Party, the conservative, the right side, is the party of the working class and the people with a high school education and no more now. And the Democratic Party is overly represented by the more elite, wealthier, college educated. And so the question that reminds me of is that Kaushik said that when you have a serious inequality, the voice of the people is unheard. And I'm not sure that that's what's happened here.
Yeah. That's a very, very, very interesting point. But here comes another thing. I know there's an element of risk of superciliousness over here, of saying that people misunderstand what's in their own interest. But I've just written an op-ed that I must pick up on that. Again, I'm going back to my childhood, playing games. When some kids came whom you did not want to include in the game, you whispered to the other serious players the term ele bele in my mother tongue. It simply means that we will pretend they are playing, but they are not playing. They are ele beles. All the real players know that they are ele beles, but the ele beles are playing thinking that they are playing. It's a way to delude those people into feeling happy. I do feel that for complicated reasons I don't fully understand, the world is getting into that where people are misunderstanding some of their own interests. Don't really want to take the stance that I want to therefore decide for them, but yes, open up discussions, Abbey series, get them involved, get them talking. I do feel people are misunderstanding. It's something to do with social media, something to do with the way information spreads, but that is a problem that you want them to understand what is their own interest better than what they seem to be doing right now.
Great. So it sounds like, both of you agree on poverty's bad, we want equality of opportunity and social mobility, and there's just some disagreement about whether we should be worried about inequality of wealth and income insofar as it might lead to undermining democracy or harming democracy to some extent. Great.
Douglas, can I jump in with just one more thing on this, which is, it may interest you, Robert, also because it's a very practical matter in the World Bank. The World Bank has this thing that poverty eradication is the World Bank's fundamental aim. When I was there and I took the initiative, we put in another thing, we called it the shared prosperity objective, which was, you compare nations and compare growth, but the growth of the bottom 40% of every country. So you literally take all countries in the world, look at the bottom 40% and how well they are growing. So you're interested in growth, but you're picking it up by the bottom segment. It's a bit of a Rawlsian view to growth that we were promoting, which is an effort to blend the two together, the growth and interest in the bottom segment.
And I think it's worth bringing up, Kaushik, that I think you would agree that from a world perspective, and this gets to our current political environment, that the growth of free market trade and greater openness to free market policies has been an enormously positive force in reducing poverty in the world in the past 50 years. That's Angus Deaton's thesis. And that's, again, that is, I think, accepted as truth. And then the other thing about that is that also led to greater inequality because the markets do lead to winners and losers sometimes, and that's part of a free market economy.
Yes, but with again, a possible disagreement. What you do want is the enterprise space, but there are two kinds of state interventions. The government can get big in two ways. One is for the government to take over the production, so nationalized firms, the state-run firms. Other is a lean intervention for transfers. For instance, inheritance tax, so that at the time of birth, you're not born abject poverty. So these are little transfers, you don't need a big state for that. The state comes in, does the transfer, and then allows the enterprise to flourish. We don't talk in terms of this. Most of the time when we think of the bigger state, we think of the production being taken over by the state. But once you think of different kinds of state intervention, you can have a lean state playing a transfer role and then allowing enterprise to function. I feel there ought to be more research into this.
Yeah, at AEI we are the right of center conservative think tank, but we've made peace with the government, post FDR, and recognized that the state has a role. And so I think that people that are for free enterprise and freedom, which might lead to greater inequality, you can't categorize them as being completely, libertarian and anti-government entirely. When I say that I support transfers that support work, I'm acknowledging the role of government. It may not be a lean state, it may be a little not lean enough, but it has a role.
Yeah.
All right, so I wanted to come back to jobs. And you mentioned just that there's a lot of focus on jobs when the jobs report comes out, and that seems to be a really important indicator of whether the economy is doing well, doing poorly. And if you think about just the United States, we put a lot of emphasis on work, right? People work a lot more than other countries, not every country, but some countries. And a lot of our social programs are also structured on the expectation that people will make a living by participating in the labor market. And so, on the other hand, though, we also see, and some of these are sort of more on the sort of utopian level, but we do see policy proposals to really reduce the amount that people need to work to make a living. So there's ideas of moving to a 4-day work week, right? There's the ideas of implementing universal basic income where people would have a consistent, regular income from the government without having to show that they're looking for work or have a job. And so this is sort of a big picture question, but how should we think about the role of work in the good economy?
So it should be no surprise to anyone here that I'm a big proponent of the benefits of work, not only for the earnings and income that comes in the household, but also for the strengthening of the social capital that's so important. So people that work regularly are more likely to be healthy. They have less interactions with the healthcare system. They are more likely to stay free of the criminal justice system. There's a lot of data on people coming home from prison. When we get them into work rapidly, they're much less likely to engage in activity that would be called recidivism and bring them back into prison. They're better parents. They're better examples for their children. As I mentioned before, my own experience with neighborhoods where there's less work versus neighborhoods where there's a lot of work, the neighborhoods are more lively, more open, more happy, more positive. So the benefits of work are much greater than just income. And I think we're seeing the negative consequences on no work in what's happened to a portion of the male population of the United States that's dropped out of the labor force, are long-term either recipients of disability benefits or other kinds of benefits. They're staying at home, they're watching a lot of screen time, they're not healthy, they're engaging in behavior that leads to what Angus Deaton and others have called deaths of despair. That's being outside of the labor force. So I'm a complete believer in that making for a healthier community, healthier citizens, healthier parents. I would just add, with regard to the UBI, I'm completely opposed to that because it disincentivizes work. And it does establish not a lean state, a big state that says you are a ward of the state from the day you're born. It's our responsibility as the government to care for you, and there isn't a reciprocal responsibility. There isn't a role of the citizen themselves. There's no self-reliance. I don't want people to be all on their own, but I don't want them also to be thinking of themselves as a ward of the state from the day they're born, and that's what the UBI leads to.
No, over here, this is something I would have agreed if we were debating 40 years ago. But I have disagreement now because, Robert, my view is that option we may not have. As technology comes in, work is already going down and may begin to virtually vanish, and then you have to think in terms of what do you do when that happens. See, and my feeling that yes, in a world where work is important, which was the case 40 years ago before the digital world, where to be sitting at home not working, you didn't feel diminished. But when work is actually vanishing, that won't happen. And the example I take is if you go back to feudalism in Europe, we didn't feel bad for the feudal lords who didn't have to do any work. That the serfs were working all the time, we didn't feel miserable that they were getting their income and wealth and everything without having to work. Others were working. So if a time comes when work is virtually vanishing, we will have to think of ways in which we compensate. My own preference is not for UBI, but for something else, which someone called Weitzman, who earlier had written, which is the idea of a shared economy in the following sense. Fraction of shares, the income coming out of equity, should go to people. After all, if I have equity somewhere, I don't have to work, I just earn out of it. But if a fraction, 20% is shared across a society, it's like universal basic income, it's universal basic shares. In a world where work is vanishing, you are giving them a right the way a lot of the rich have rights because they have shares in a company. I think you can work this out and actually have a vibrant economy with that in place.
But isn't it true that people have been worried about the advent of technology ending the existence of work for hundreds of years, and those predictions have not come true? And I guess you would say, well, this time they will.
That's exactly what I mean.
I'd say, I don't think so. I mean, I think there will be a lot of, there is, with creative enterprises, there's also creative destruction. So there are going to be transitions, there are going to be challenges, but I think there's a world in which the advance of technology increases incomes and productivity and other kinds of work. And I think what's gone wrong in America for some part of our electorate is people have refused to acknowledge that it's important to make adjustments and to change and to move. For instance, one of the things that I've always been fascinated by is the extent to which people who, when things are not so great in the place they're in, pick up sticks and go to a place where there is opportunity. Those families and those citizens always do better because they had the incentive to move, they moved, and they restarted. And I think if you try to say, no, let's just keep everybody where they are, you'll have a very stagnant and much less dynamic country.
On work, I want to put in a point that I feel this is not a matter of policy or intervention. This is really a very critical time for economics and larger philosophy, the meaning of work. So what you're saying may be right, that work will continue, but in a very different sense. And I'll give you an analogy that activities which in economics we define work in a very mechanical way. That's something for which you need to be compensated you don't like to do. But if all the things that you don't like to do are being taken over by machines, a new form of work can appear where what you like to do, someone else likes you to do even more and pays you for it. And there's a concrete example I will give is teaching, for instance, is treated as something when you're teaching regularly, you want to be paid. The students come in and pay. But we have examples where these things can begin to flip. And in this case, the example goes far back into history. It's believed that Socrates used to enjoy teaching so much that he would be willing to pay to people to come in and put in the labor of listening to him. Sit down and listen to Socrates teaching. But this is not just a jocular remark. I feel a lot of activities which are pleasant enough activities will now acquire the status of labor because someone else likes me to play the music or do art more than I like to do. So a very new domain of labor economics we are entering into. This is not an immediate policy matter, but I think it's for people in the world of research and ideas, it's an important domain to explore.
Wonderful. So yeah, and I think that's a nice way to think just about how the, different...
Could I just ask, Kaushik, because we're here at UNC, what's going through my mind, I think you said that people who once were doing things and not getting paid for it, like it so much that it's an activity they enjoy greatly, they can convince people to pay them for it anyway. Is that what you just said?
Yeah, I mean, Paul Samuelson, guru in my field, says that all his life he has been paid for what he would anyway do, which is research in economics.
Yes.
And so yes, I mean, in the end you like it, but others are beginning to compensate you, and there are other things that others like and you compensate them. But very sort of inchoate early thought about the way we have to approach labor in the new world.
I'm just trying to think of the big development in labor for people doing things they like to do but weren't paid for a long time is very prevalent here at UNC in the athletes in the major sports areas who are now, at long last, finally getting paid as they should have been. Do we agree on that one?
Yeah, that's a very big one. Yeah, very interesting one.
So we'll end that portion of the event on a note of agreement. And so now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. And I'm going to start with a question from a member of the Carolina alumni who has submitted a question in advance. And it actually touches a little bit on something that came up that we didn't really explore, which is the idea of crony capitalism. So I just, the question is really about how should we think about the difference between capitalism and crony capitalism, and how both relate to a free and open economy. And I think that it's already come up in our discussion. I think one of you was commenting just on current economies in the world and where we might be headed towards crony capitalism. So I don't know if either of you wants to take the lead on that, and then we can open it up for questions from the audience.
Go ahead.
Well, I would just say that we don't like feathering the nest. We don't like crony capitalism. We don't like the term in economics is there's a term that you use. What's it called? Well, in any case, it'll come to you in a minute. And to me, the key is the rule of law, and you have to have nobody at AEI would not say that part of a properly functioning free market economy is a method for disputes and unfair practices to be resolved in an orderly and effective way, where businesses can come and plead their case and get fair treatment. We think that's been for a long time one of the great characteristics of the United States, that investors and business people could know that they would be treated fairly in accordance with the rule of law when they came to do business in the United States. That's distinguished us, I think, from other parts of the world where that wasn't so straightforward. And I know a lot of people in the business world who just won't do business in places where crony capitalism is running amok, or there's no rule of law. I think for us as a country in the United States, this is something we should watch very carefully. It does concern me that some of the guideposts and the parameters around our economy have the potential to be eroded with the current administration. And that's going to be, I mentioned a couple other things I'm worried about, that's also going to be something that will be damaging to our economy.
And to add to this, one of the reasons why crony capitalism is risky in every country is our understanding of it is extremely rudimentary. It is almost like the understanding of market economy before Adam Smith. We didn't understand. It was Adam Smith who gave structure to that. Cronyism is at a similar stage, and I'll point to something very specific. Starting with Adam Smith, then roughly 100 years later, Leon Walras, the standard model of economics became that take any commodity, there are some people demanding it, some supplying it, and a price gets formed where the demand is equal to supply, and you take that for every commodity, and you have this massive general equilibrium system. What that overlooks is that along with that, we always have, and maybe this is increasing, there are these commodities where, yes, there's a market price we are buying and selling, but there's also scope for barter. I do a favor to you and you do a favor to me. And if you have a market economy with also barter deals going on, those barter deals in a rich economy, when it's being between a politician and a business person, these barters are taking place, it can lead into, have you walk into a crony capitalist system. I think we understand this, the pure logic of it, this very poorly, and we are at a juncture of the world where we need an Adam Smith for the new world that is opening up in front of us to understand crony capitalism so that we are aware that every country has a risk of that, and you want to take steps so that we don't walk into it.
The term I was thinking of is rent seeking.
Correct. Yes.
Am I right about
Yeah.
that?
Absolutely.
That's what we have to worry about.
All right, questions from the audience. So it's a little bit hard for me to see.
Yes, I can't see.
Daniel?
Thank you all very much for the stimulating discussion. Mostly we've been talking so far, thank you.
Mostly so far, we've been talking about a particular nation's economy. But earlier, when you mentioned tariffs, I thought I would ask, how important is it for the health of an economy, the way that that economy trades with its allies and deals with its adversaries?
Yeah, extremely important. And with globalization, that's become very, very important. So in fact, running a policy for a particular country, if you pretend that it's a closed economy and try to run the best policies, you're going to run into a wall because it is a very, very linked world. And on globalization, I should just tell you that unlike some people who resist it, to me, the process of globalization Whether you like it or not, that is an unimportant discussion because it's an inevitable part of the march of technology that the world is getting globalized. It's almost like saying, I don't like gravity. You can have distaste for gravity, but there's nothing you can do about it. Globalization is a bit like that. It's a part of life, we have to live with it. And given that that is there, we do need policies where you're aware of that, and not just that. I feel multilateral with cross-country policies. There's an ever-growing need. There are areas where we became very aware of globalization. For instance, in labor policies, one country would say that, look, we will keep our wages suppressed and take in your capital over here and make our workers be forced laborers. Another country, poor country, is forced to play that game. ILO, International Labour Organization, came in with ILO conventions, getting cross-country agreements that we are not going to play this game of deliberately keeping our wages low. This need is arising now across the domain. Taxation, for instance. One country plays off another country in terms of taxation. I know these are very, very hard, whether we will be able to get into agreements or not, cross-country, but the time has come where we will have to sit together and have a minimal amount of rules, which are the rule of law that you're talking about, that has to go across nations minimally for the world to thrive and do well in a globalized state.
So AI scholars are writing often about this. We believe in free trade and the free movement of goods and services and labor around the world. That's normally better for prosperity for all of us. There's a lot of evidence for that. But in addition, that you have to, sometimes when adversaries and even non-adversaries don't play fair, and it's not a fair game, and you're being taken advantage of, and you need to make some actions to address them. And then finally, with regard to adversaries in a very dangerous world, we've been supporters of export controls on certain kinds of sophisticated military technology going to China or Russia or North Korea or Iran. And that, I think, is perfectly legitimate when you're dealing with countries whose attitudes toward freedom and democracy and their neighbors are dangerous. And so we tilt toward freedom. Every exchange, if we make a change, you got something and I got something. And there are comparative advantages for different kinds of manufacturing, different kinds of work that we should take advantage of in this world economy. And frankly, over the last 50 years, we have, and net all in all, it's benefited the country dramatically. It's left some parts of our country behind because of the transition that comes with creative destruction and changes in the success of various industries. We haven't done a very good job of addressing those weak spots, but instead of throwing out the baby, which is the prosperity that comes from global interaction, and fixing the problem, we're doing the opposite, which I think is a big mistake.
Can I add a quick remark? Let me hold back, there may be an opportunity.
All right, other questions? So there's one here, there's one couple down in front over here as well.
Hi, so my question is basically your thoughts on what a lot of people are calling, I guess for lack of a better term, the death of the neoliberal consensus, for Democrats and Republicans since like the 70s. There's been this consensus of like free trade, globalization, industrial policy generally we stray away from just for like a long time, just basically like, I guess, I don't know, the people who take out subscriptions to The Economist magazine, those people just kind of like run the country for like both parties. And then we had like the populist wave in the 2010s with like Trump, and he did like, for the first time, like tariffs, and even Biden, he continued a lot of the Trump tariffs, he expanded them, and he did the biggest piece of industrial policy in decades with the Inflation Reduction Act. And even like under Biden, you see a lot of like new antitrust stuff that like hadn't been happening a long time. Just curious as to why you thought that happened, like what changed in American politics that kind of led to that consensus shift in both parties.
Happily pass it to Robert first.
So the financial crisis played a big role in the sense that something happened that a lot of people weren't held accountable for, and it was very damaging to the net worths and the incomes of a broad slice of America's middle class. I think COVID put us back even a little bit too, that caused us some uncertainty. I think the tensions that have occurred in certain communities and their political significance, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, has played a role. I am not one of these people that feel that because that the entire neoliberal consensus is dead. Because while people say that, and the politics of America looks like it, the economy that the neoliberal consensus created marches on. It's still here. It's still moving forward. And the really significant changes to our economy that would have to occur because that consensus is dead haven't. They haven't gotten the politics of it together to pass really, in my opinion, significant legislation. I grant you that the first act of the Biden administration that blew out the debt, the deficit more than it needed to, was a bad sign, but the fact that it contributed to inflation has been rejected by the populists, and the country's still very divided on that. So, you know, I know that the people that because of the election of Trump and the fact that the Democrats have moved far away from Bill Clinton, that they think, well, there's no neoliberal consensus, but when I look at what's really happening in the states and in the way our economy is run, I don't see it yet. I don't see it changing the way our businesses and firms and workers are operating.
You know, my feeling is the roots of this, yes, there was COVID, there's the Great Recession of 2008, the subprime crisis, all these things played a role. But I do believe that some of the trouble started, again, decades ago with the rise of technology. And not for a moment am I playing this down. You can go back to the Industrial Revolution and look at it, that the first 40, 50 years of the Industrial Revolution, the world looked dismal. It's only because we came back to the Industrial Revolution with intelligent thinking that we overcame the problem. And so right now, the drop in demand for labor, you can see it statistically. If you take rich countries like United States, Europe, Japan, and look at the share of the GDP that goes to workers as their income, over the last 50 years, I've got these charts with me, it's a steady decline for all of them. So the share of earned income is going down, and that's by virtue of technology. So you have to think of very novel policies to come in over here, and the way I get hope from the Industrial Revolution is that 1842, by when the Industrial Revolution is stale and causing a lot of problems, from pollution to child labor, it was quite a mess. New policies started coming in, and one policy which that time looked like a shockingly radical intervention was the income tax being brought in 1842. Thank goodness for that. We realized that you do need new policies to come in. Quite what the new policies are now, I don't know. But since you mentioned tariffs, I personally believe that leaving countries as open as possible with low tariffs is the good way to go. One mistake which I really worry about what United States might do today is match other people's high tariff with high tariff over here. If you do that with every country around the world, in the end, what you've done is you've ring-fenced yourself by high tariffs across everyone else. I really fear that there is a risk that the United States is going to do great damage to its own economy by responding in a knee-jerk fashion, by high tariff to high tariff vis-a-vis every country, and end up ring-fencing itself.
It's a question down here, second row.
Thank you for your very provocative discussions. And just want to ask, what excites you and what scares you about the new administration?
You gonna go first on that one?
Reluctantly, but I'll do that. I am extremely worried because I don't see a cogency in the policy. You know, there are policies with which I disagree because I can see there's a cogent plan, which I don't see that. So I do feel extremely worried. And some of these things, what I was just now referring to, this reciprocal policy, which may look right, but it is not quite clear what it leads to. Also, I'll give you another thing, that the worry that United States runs a deficit, trade deficit with another country. No, that is the whole purpose of trade, that you run a deficit with one country, you run a surplus with another country. If you don't run a deficit with any country, you're back to the world of barter, which is not very efficient. And one advantage of being a country whose currency the world respects and uses is you can afford to run up trade deficits. You have to be careful, not too much. But I feel a lot of the policies right now are happening in a very, very knee-jerk fashion, and that does worry me greatly about the US economy and globally, because the United States is so important.
So he didn't mention what excited him, so I'll do a little bit of that. I'm very excited about the shift in attitudes toward race-based interventions, obsessions about race. I think the anti-DEI stuff is good. I think there's an aspect of the obsession over equity and the misinterpretation of equity leading to treating people based on their race, not on their merit, was a real problem and upset Americans and was unfair, was in its own way an aspect of crony capitalism. I like the focus on choice in schools. I like the focus on reforming universities to bring greater viewpoint diversity. I think that's desperately needed. I like the focus on reducing regulation that for people like my wife and other friends of ours who are in small business, that just does put a sort of heavy hand of the government and make it harder to start a business and to make a business grow. So I think there's a lot there in the new administration that's positive. I've been struck by the extent to which some of their other actions have not led to the market losing confidence in our economy. And I think that's because they really like those things. They like that freeing up. On the worrisome side, the number one thing is America's role in the world. In the last week and a half, or in the last few days, when in the past, the President of the United States and the United States was viewed as always being on the side of freedom, always being on the side of democracy, always being on the side of the little country that being bullied by a bigger country, and always being on the side of a free and independent Europe from the influence of authoritarian Russia, seems to have just disappeared in 3 days. And I think that is very, very troubling. And we've bungled, we've done things in the world in the post 9/11 wars in Vietnam, where we didn't always operationalize our ideals very well, or we made mistakes. But we always were doing it with a spirit about democracy and freedom and anti-authoritarianism, in my judgment, that was inspiring and great. And this administration doesn't seem to care about that respect for our history of being a beacon of freedom around the world that both President Kennedy and President Reagan talked about. And that is very troubling.
In the second row, there's, in the back.
Hi. So throughout the conversations, you guys mentioned, like Adam Smith and his ideas. Specifically, I was curious about your opinions on his invisible hand, and I know we also talked about briefly like moral qualities. So to me, I'm thinking like in like a worker's like integrity or like honesty in working, and also on the other side of that, recruiters like kind of biased or any biases potentially. So I wanted to ask to what extent do these moral qualities kind of affect the economy's ability to flourish?
So, tell me if I'm not getting to quite what you're asking. What does concern me is some of those early thinkings which gave birth to economics, Adam Smith being most prominent. There are changes taking place where the discipline is not living up with the changes. And since you mentioned invisible hand, that's fascinating to me because the invisible hand idea of Adam Smith was, everyone knows, but I'll still repeat, it's a 1-minute summary. There are a whole hundreds and thousands of people demanding something, hundreds and thousands of people producing that. A price gets fixed. Who fixes it, how that happens is left a bit murky. That's the invisible hand of the market that fixes it. Think of the modern world. There are a whole lot of people who are wanting a taxi ride, a whole lot of cars wanting to give these rides. Who brings them together? It's not the invisible hand of the market, but it's Uber. The invisible hand has suddenly become a huge corporation that's playing an important role of bringing these markets together, which needs a very different kind of policy thought. You can't just go back to antitrust legislation, the Sherman Act of 1890, and bring that in and make that more effective. The nature of markets is changing in a fundamental way, and we need to attend to that, and that's the reason why I was referring to that. One more thing I want to mention, which you touched on, is things like certain normative standards of integrity are crucial for markets to function. If I, going into the marketplace, the first thing I do is I punch the other person in the nose and take away the goods, the market is not going to function. It's only because we are virtually programmed not to do that, that the market functions. And this is the notion that people have written about, that for the economy to function, it has to be embedded in certain norms and culture which are so much a part of life, we don't realize the importance of that. But when the nature of the market changes, it is time for us to go back and rethink some of the norms which made market possible, and we may need some changes in this. So hence the reference I was making to these founding figures for economics.
Maybe down in front here.
So as we know, the Federal Reserve likes to talk frequently about its dual mandate, right, of maximizing both price stability and employment. But often, these variables are in conflict with each other, right? So we have policies that increase employment but can increase inflation at the same time, or vice versa. So as we add more of these variables, these health variables, educational, hedonistic, distributional variables, what conflicts do you see between those and the existing, macroeconomic variables, and how do you prioritize when there are conflicts?
Well, I'll go just first on the Federal Reserve. I don't think we want to expand on the Federal Reserve's mandate into these new measures. I think that would be a mistake. I frankly think that the dual mandate is tough and hard, and they don't always get it right. But in their role, they should stay in that role. I would not want to expand them into different roles. But it is an interesting question you ask about who resolves when there's so much we have to deal with. And it reminded me a little bit of the crisis during COVID, when politicians and leaders who were responsible for making decisions about our economy drove to their decision entirely by the input from the public health experts, who came in, and I saw this working for Mayor Bloomberg and other circumstances, or Governor Pataki, when you're doing a balancing act with a leader about what decision they're going to make, and someone says, yeah, you could do that, but someone might die, or we will have, an increase in unnecessary deaths, that can stop the discussion right there. And I sometimes think that when we limit ourselves in the decision-making process to one criteria, we can make mistakes, and that we don't see the full picture. And I think one of the failings of the COVID crisis was that political leaders, were driven entirely by one element and didn't see the full picture. And so I don't know if this answers your question, except to say that we can't be so narrow on any one measure, because in doing that, we're going to miss the whole picture. And you have to do balancing. These are not easy decisions. I'm not saying they're simple, and you're not always going to get it right. But if you obsess about one, you're gonna make mistakes at.
Yeah, very little to add, and that's right, that you try to avoid these mistakes, not be hooked onto just one recipe. At the same time, we do know that mistakes will happen. I mean, I think of inflation as a very good example. Some of the world's biggest inflations were in Europe. 1923 Germany, everyone talks about, but even bigger inflation in Hungary in 1946. Unbelievable levels of inflation. Got triggered off by reasonable governments, hooked on one particular theory, making a mistake, and then it goes out of control. So yes, you should be open, but despite that, occasional mistakes will happen, and then you go back, take stock, and then be ready for the next round.
I think we have time for one more question.
I first want to say thank you so much for being here. Given the significant federal job cuts that the Department of Government Efficiency is making, do you think that this approach is counterproductive to boosting the economy and reducing national debt, or do you think it's just short-term pain for a longer-term gain?
So I've been in government for most of my career until I came to AEI. The federal government's very large. Do I believe that the headcount of the federal government is set at the right amount? No, and I think there are opportunities for savings. I think the current administration is going at it in a pretty brutal way, but I don't think that I certainly don't think that the cuts in federal employees will be material on affecting the overall economy negatively. They also won't be, I don't think, material in reducing the debt or deficit either. But they will be an effort to increase efficiency and productivity among the federal workforce that I think is needed. So, they're getting a lot of headlines, they're making a lot of noise, but the number of reductions are not that large to affect the overall economy, in my opinion, or the long-term debt and deficit situation. And they may, I think more likely, lead to greater productivity and efficiency, but also, and the people are going to have to respond to this, they're going to lead to mistakes and errors and important jobs not getting done. And our task as a country is to monitor that, call attention to it, and then bring those issues to the people in the next election.
I'm more worried about this because there are certain things, even if you know that overall that's the right direction to go, the minutiae of the problem, and many of these interventions are like an engineering problem. You have to do it very carefully, and I'm not getting that sense. And that worries me. The analogy I could give is that if you're trying to do surgery to remove a malignant tissue, you have to be very, very careful not to damage healthy tissues around that. Whereas if you don't do that and just go after that without that scientific input, you can do huge damage, and it's very early days, but I do worry about big damage because even if the broad direction is right, the minuteness of the design, I don't feel confident is being done carefully enough.
Great, so thanks so much for coming, and let's conclude.